Hey guys, this week's question is all about imposter syndrome. So we're going to look at what the science has to say when we are confronted with imposter syndrome, when we're struggling with it, when we want to overcome it, and what are the actual techniques that have been proven to work versus just public opinion. So I'm going to pop up the question right here. And here we go. So I've been having a hard time pursuing a lot of projects. I'm on the verge of creating a big one and turn it into a nice living. But I struggle with imposter syndrome and I hate it. If you've experienced it before, how do you overcome it? So this question's in Reddit, and there are quite a few opinion-based responses to the question, but I'm curious to see, what does the actual science say on imposter syndrome, and are there actually scientifically validated treatments to this or exercises that this individual or anyone else can do to overcome imposter syndrome? So I first came across this JAMA piece. It's an opinion piece right here, and I thought it was interesting because it actually speaks to the fact that imposter syndrome might be more a result of an institutional cause and not an individual cause. In that it's not the person's fault that they feel imposter syndrome, it's more the fact that around them, the environment causes them to feel imposter syndrome. And in this case, they were speaking about physicians. So you can imagine being a physician is a competitive industry. There's not a lot of room for vulnerability. And then it just kind of leads individuals to feel like, hey, maybe I have these thoughts that I'm not good enough, and no one else has these thoughts. And maybe those are indicative of the fact that I actually am not good enough. But here, Dr. Mulanji argues that it's actually normal to feel imposter syndrome. It's actually almost like a normal human reaction, given the circumstances that these physicians are in. And I think with physicians, you can compare this to really any high stress competitive industry, being a lawyer, being a CEO, things like that. So I'm gonna go over here to the next article that we have that's really interesting. It was a huge, fairly large meta-analysis on, same article. We wanna see the meta-analysis here. All right, here we go. You guys can probably see it, but I have a whole bunch of other articles. So we want to look at this meta-analysis of imposter syndrome. So if you don't know what a meta-analysis is, it's actually like a study of a bunch of studies. So you know that usually there's a ton of experimental studies in psychology, psychiatry, and a meta-analysis actually pulls together all of those studies and gives you the effect size, or kind of how effective the science was in relation to this topic. So here they're saying that across the studies, they found that imposter syndrome can range from 9 to 82% prevalence in the population, which means that it can be fairly uncommon or extremely common. That's not super helpful. But what I did find interesting is that imposter syndrome is often comorbid with depression and anxiety, which comorbidity is just another word for occurring at the same time as. So it's more common that an individual with imposter syndrome would also perhaps suffer from depression. And it also appears here that it's impaired job performance, job satisfaction, and burnout. And it's interesting because our previous article actually referenced burnout as well, and that maybe imposter syndrome should be thought more of in the same category as we think of burnout, in which we think burnout as a more institutional issue and not so much an individual issue, right? You guys see where I'm going here? Let's see, we see that people with imposter syndrome struggle with accurately attributing their performance to their actual competence. We're going to talk about some strategies on how to address this in a couple minutes. I wanted to show you guys, and this study here was by Dr. Bavada and colleagues. Just wanted to give them a shout out. So I wanted to show you guys one more study, which I found extremely interesting. And I'm not sure if you guys can see it yet. Bear with me. Here we go. All right. So this is in Frontiers in Psychology. And it's a study focusing on the neuropsychobiological underpinnings of imposter syndrome. So that's just like a super technical way of saying, you know, the mind and the body and the brain are all connected. And we might, our behaviors and thoughts are kind of all a cause of this. So here we take a look at this study, and this is by Troussos and colleagues, and they speak of imposter syndrome as potentially a protective mechanism for individuals to have a fear of shame in relation to, and it having an evolutionary function of keeping them in the tribe. So if we think about it, we all know that humans are extremely social creatures, and we kind of have this kind of evolutionary like angst of like being alone, and anything that we think might cause us to, you know, kind of be pushed out or maybe not accepted by others, our brains really like focus on those things. And with here, I thought this highlight of shame was extremely interesting, because we can kind of loop that back to the institutionalized imposter syndrome that they were speaking of in the first article. And they actually kind of hinted at the fact that perhaps this institutional imposter syndrome exists because physicians or any other really high power professional, any successful person, we don't really live in a culture of vulnerability. If somebody is successful, we don't really see a lot of people speaking out to, you know, I used to have these hard times, but I got through them and now I'm successful. People who are successful, or thought leaders, or anyone that is thought of as an expert, they don't really spend a lot of time reflecting on their hard days and the times that they struggled. They're more focusing on the fact that they're doing great now and they're an expert, and they kind of act like they've always been there, which to anyone who's just starting out, or to anyone that's kind of in the middle, or to anyone that's going through a rough patch, can feel extremely demoralizing. So this particular question actually came from the startup, the startup subreddit. And you can imagine that anyone who's starting their own startup can feel kind of like, you know, they're at the beginning of this really unknown, crazy journey. And you can think of all kind of the startup founders that come to mind that have been successful. You know, you have your like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, things like that. Like, they don't show a lot of vulnerability. Like, so if you're just starting out, that gap between the person who's starting and the person who's successful is so wide, and nobody talks about that space. It's almost kind of like, of course we would feel imposter syndrome. In psychology, we call this social psychology versus individual psychology. So we know the environment is very strong. So we have to remember that not to take so much burden upon ourselves of feeling a certain emotion. It's kind of remember that this is kind of a natural human reaction to the environment that we live in. And if you ever want to look at kind of shame research, Brene Brown's a big leader in this field, and it can lead to a lot of psychological distress. And I think maybe one of the biggest things that we could do for imposter syndrome is have individuals who have made it really talk about those hard parts in their life, kind of the dark night of the soul, the time that the hero goes into the forest and it's black and dark and they have no idea if they're going to come out, because everyone has had those, but we don't glamorize them, and we don't talk to them as much. Talk about them as much. So I wanted to reference one more thing here, is that people with imposter syndrome seem to have quite a bit of stress, and the stress system seems to be quite a bit activated in imposter syndrome. So we call this the HPA axis. And so this study then asks the question, could imposter syndrome be mediated by stress interventions? So that's what I wanted to talk about next and kind of offer maybe some science-based suggestions to addressing imposter syndrome. So here we have kind of imposter syndrome. We talked about how it could be institutional, maybe based on the shame culture we live in, and that stress interventions are a mediator for imposter syndrome. So that means that basically any study that has been found to reduce stress should also be able to reduce imposter syndrome. Okay, so I put this in quotations because they're not actual cures. I mean, we can't really call it a cure scientifically, but there is evidence to the fact that things like narrative coaching, so this is actually really simple to understand, but it sounds kind of confusing. So this is just the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. So if you notice, you always kind of have like a story about yourself that's running in the background of your head, like like a movie, and you're the main character, right? So if we think about that story and we really laser focus in exactly what we're telling ourselves, we can see that, like, hey, I'm actually not like really, looking like the hero of the story. I'm actually being super discouraging. I'm actually looking at this challenge as like, kind of like I can't overcome it. Like I'm not looking at it like from like kind of the zoomed out view where, in 10 years, like I overcame everything and I like ended up much stronger for it. So there's quite a bit of evidence for this. There's all kinds of techniques, questions, worksheets that you can do. I'll link it below in the description. So if you're interested in that, it's actually quite effective and also kind of fun. It's like a fun intervention. And here we have also gratitude / positive psychology exercises. So we know that when it comes to positive psychology, a lot of the interventions will lower stress levels, just because feeling positive emotions can actually lower your stress levels. They can also make you more creative. They can increase your immune system, which is kind of a fun fact. So anything from kind of the positive psychology world, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about this kind of in the general media. So we see like gratitude journals, gratitude letters, and it just kind of helps your brain refocus on what you have instead of what you don't have. And you can kind of see how that would kind of help you kind of settle down your stress response. Because if you think about it, stress is a kind of a response to, it could potentially be a response to scarcity, right? So if we kind of focus on like, hey, maybe my startup isn't, crushing it yet, but I have, a great family and I have a great co-founder and I'm really happy in that. And we're really on the right track and we're going to have some really exciting years ahead of us. The way to do this really is to do it kind of in small steps every day. So if you kind of think of your brain as like a muscle, you kind of want to just like do a few reps every day to build that up. And it kind of really will help rewire the circuits in your brain to kind of next time that you have like, a thought, like just, a thought that, how thoughts like come and go in your brain, it can just naturally occur to be more likely of a positive gratitude-based thought, if that makes sense. So I will link those in the description and look forward to more videos like this. If you like these videos, hit the like button so that I kind of know what to make. And please put any questions you have below. I will insert any links that I have missed. And if you have a question for the next segment of Ask Science, feel free to ask below or message me online. I hope that these kind of science-based interventions are helpful to people, and I hope that we kind of make a good impact in the world of like bringing more science to the world and maybe a little bit less public opinion. Okay, I'll see you guys next time.